Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I talk? Yeah, good. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming on Sunday. And I hope that we will have an interesting and a rewarding discussion for the effort you have made today. We decided on this event, like other events that we are doing all over Europe, because of the significance of the month of May in Palestine's history, and of course the significance, the symbolic significance of the dates before and after the 15th of May, which in a consensual way became the Nakba Day, the day of the commemoration about the catastrophe. I was asked to reflect on this day and on that event in 1948, and I'm sure most of what I have to say is familiar ground to many of you, but I think it's worthwhile every year, again and again, to think about what happened in 1948 to the Palestinians, and to think of the implications in 2014 of these catastrophic events back then. I was, when I started to write about 1948, when I became engaged with the topic, one of the first things that I became aware of was the lack of conceptual framework for analyzing the events in Palestine in 1948. The term used by the Palestinians, Nakba, catastrophe, looked to me as unsatisfactory as explaining what happened, why it happened, and what are the implications of what happened. I could fully understand what happens when a term becomes part of your national dictionary. It becomes a sacred term, so you do not change it with another term. The Nakba became symbolically the main reference to the tragedy of the Palestinian people in Palestine. But there's something very vague about the term catastrophe, whether you say it in Danish, Swedish, Arabic, or English. A catastrophe has many victims, but it doesn't have victimizers. It doesn't have a reference to who is responsible for it. And we know that what happened in Palestine was not a natural disaster. It was a human disaster. There were human beings who are responsible for that disaster. And there's something in the term Nakba that almost absolved anyone from what happened. It focuses on what happened, but not who is responsible for it. And I was looking, and I'm sure I was not the only one, I was looking for a concept that looks at 1948 not just as a disaster, but as something that actively was done by one group of people to another group of people. And the terminology that came out of the ex-Yugoslavia civil war in the 1990s that brought to our attention once again the term ethnic cleansing seemed to me to fit very well as an analysis and as a description the events of 1948. And that's when I decided to write on 1948 as the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Realizing, of course, that ethnic cleansing in the 1990s is a new idea, and I'm borrowing a new idea to describe an old event, but nonetheless I felt very secure and confident that this was the right approach to 1948. And as the years went by, I'm even more confident than before that this term, ethnic cleansing, is not only the most appropriate way to describe what was done to the Palestinians in 1948. It is a very appropriate term to describe what Israel is doing today in Palestine. it is still, for me, the most accurate description of the motives, the ideology, the strategies, and the tactics that Israel uses or is informed by when it engages with the Palestinians wherever they are. And the one thing you realize with time about ethnic cleansing, that this act, that according to the international law, is a crime against humanity, that according to the international consensus is one of the most hideous policies that a state or a movement can enact against another group. Only genocide seems to be worse in the international terminology for what humans can do to other human beings. That this term, this idea, this concept of ethnic cleansing is something that will continue unless it is stopped. The one thing you realize over the years, that ethnic cleansing can only stop in two conditions. Either the project of ethnic cleansing is completed successfully, then the people who are involved in ethnic cleansing relax and they don't do anything in that respect, or the ethnic cleansing is being forced to stop. It does not end itself because people are tired or because people had enough. It will not end by itself. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine will continue either until the whole of Palestine is ethnically cleansed, or we will be able, as an international community, as a regional community, as a Palestinian community, to put an end to it. By itself, people will not stop until they are convinced that they have completed the project of turning Palestine into a non-Arab landscape, human landscape. Another issue that came to my mind, reflecting back on the ethnic cleansing, and now having 66 years of it since 1948, is that most of the Israeli Jews that are engaged with the Palestinians, directly or indirectly, are involved in an ethnic cleansing operation since 1914. It's almost like a business for Israelis. Most of the interaction between Israelis in positions of power, policymakers, strategists, academics who advise them, government officials on the ground, that deal with the Palestinian community, knowingly or unknowingly, sometimes unknowingly, are involved in a daily implementation of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That's why the ethnic cleansing since 1948 is not so dramatic and does not attract the attention of international media. Because if it's a daily business, you can be content by expelling one person a day, or not allowing one person a day to go back to his home. No reasonable, logical journalist would report about it when so many other terrible things are happening in the world. But it's continuing. It doesn't stop for a moment. And most of the Israeli policies that today we seem to pay attention to, the attempt to depopulate the Nakab, to expel 70,000 Palestinians under the Prather plan, the attempts to Judaize Greater Jerusalem, to somehow get rid of the 200,000 Palestinians who live there, the attempt to cleanse the Jordan Valley from its local inhabitants, the project of cleansing Akka from its Arab and Palestinian inhabitants in the old city. All these policies are part of the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So it doesn't stop by itself, and it's a daily Israeli business. But there's something else you learn when you look at the ethnic cleansing from 1948 until today. That the Israelis are very ingenious in finding alternative means to implement ethnic cleansing when direct expulsion is not possible. In 1948, they felt it was possible to, sorry, I have only two hands. Some strategic conclusions for next meeting, an open button for the speaker. Okay. Some of reflecting back, you can see that while historical circumstances allowed the Israelis to enact massive expulsion of people in 1948, historical circumstances after 1948 made it impossible to repeat the grand expulsion of 48. And one of the main things that the Israelis developed, I'm not sure whether it was systematically developed or strategically developed, it doesn't matter, but it became an important tool, is the idea that if you cannot expel someone, you at least have to make sure as plan B that he cannot move from where he is. The other side of ethnic cleansing, the other side of expulsion, is not to allow you to move. From a strategic point of view, as a Zionist, you get the same effect. The Palestinians cannot leave their houses, their homes, cannot expand, and therefore they are less of a demographic threat. Of course, it would have been better if they disappeared, but if you can't, you do that. And you can see along the history since 1948 how this concept of ethnic cleansing developed from mass expulsion to alternative ways by imposing military rule on the Palestinians who were left in Israel between 1948 to 1967, where the major inhibition was not to allow people to move freely, and of course not to allow Palestinians to develop either in their urban space or in the rural country. Until today, not one new Palestinian village was built. Not one new Palestinian neighborhood was constructed for 20% of the Israeli population. This is ethnic cleansing in other means. And then the military rule, as you know, was transferred to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, where in many ways it is still enacted today. So the third reflection I have about the ethnic cleansing in this respect is, as I said, that it doesn't end by itself, that it is a daily business, but it is also a tactic. Tactically, it can be implemented in more than one way. And this is where the analysis has to be more accurate, more focused, and because the Israelis can get away with acts of ethnic cleansing which are not direct expulsion. But it's still very important to point that the impulse, the reason why they are not allowing people to move, the reason why they're not allowing people to build another house, or to build in the old house another floor, and not to build a new neighborhood, and not to build a new village, the reason is the same reason behind the wish to expel them. And this is something that is totally absent, this recognition of what ethnic cleansing is all about as a project, as a daily Israeli business, as a project that has many faces. All these three elements have been totally ignored by those who were genuinely or cynically involved in what we call the peace process since 1967. The peace process that began in earnest after the June 67 war ignores intentionally, I think, the ideology behind the creation of the State of Israel and behind the policies towards the Palestinians as an issue that has to be dealt by international diplomacy. Unfortunately, Palestinian leaders themselves contributed to this agenda by developing fragmented agendas, because the greatest success of Zionism was to fragment the Palestinians to different groups, and different groups developed different agendas. And it was easy to ask Palestinians to deal in a peace process with the agenda of 1 or 2 out of the 5 Palestinian groups, but there is no need, the mediators said, to deal with all the Palestinian groups in order to push forward the idea of peace and settlement. So the ethnic cleansing, this ideology that is behind Zionist policies up to 1948, and Israeli policies ever since 1948 until today, is not at all an issue in the eyes of the international community when it is involved in the attempts to bring peace in Israel and Palestine. And as I said, unfortunately, locally, Jews and Palestinians, some for different reasons, supported this kind of artificial, superficial analysis of why there is a conflict that is at the bottom or the basis for the peace process. So we wasted 30, 40 years of international diplomacy. We wasted a lot of money which came with these peace efforts. We wasted a lot of goodwill by people who really thought that they are helping Israelis and Palestinians to reach peace. We wasted it in the wrong place, with the wrong money, with the wrong effort, because we did not deal as an international community with the heart of the matter. In many ways, it's a bit like the famous Jewish joke that of people who lose a key and look for it where there is light, not where they lost the key. So we were looking for the reason for the conflict, for a solution to the conflict where there was light, but not where the conflict was altogether. But it's not easy. I can understand why so many people, even at the receiving end of Zionism, find it difficult to accept that the main issue is this ideology of ethnic cleansing that is so comprehensive that it ensures that every Israeli who engages with Palestinians is contributing his or her part to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It is so sophisticated, by the way, in many respects, that even Israelis who were involved, as I was, in what I call the kissing cousin industry, you know, this coexistence industry, Arabs and Jews working together in Israel, in Hebrew, for the sake of peace, that even these people in the left Zionist groups, like Mapam, Hashomer HaTzair, who meant well, were contributing through the coexistence industry to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, unknowingly, by the way, I think. They were not always aware of what they were doing. But it is so powerful because it is so important and crucial for the success of the Zionist movement. And for that, you need, I think, an historical perspective. When I say for that, I mean for the dominant power of ethnic cleansing in the Israeli Jewish mentality, in the Israeli Jewish concept of reality. You have to understand how deeply it is important. Anybody who lived in Israel, even if they cannot articulate it, know what I'm talking about. You have it on a daily basis when you are a Palestinian in Israel. You feel it every moment in your life. You feel it in the bus, you feel it in the school, you feel it in your workplace, you feel it in the airport. Nobody has to articulate for Palestinians who are inside Israel what I'm talking about. They may not call it ethnic cleansing, it doesn't matter, but they know exactly the kind of atmosphere I'm talking about. But for someone from the outside who seriously thinks I am contributing as the Secretary of State of the United States, as the Danish Foreign Minister, as the United Nations Secretary General, I'm going to contribute to the end of the conflict, this is something that is not that easy to explain. Partly because there is an unwillingness, an understandable unwillingness, to associate Jews with such ideas because Jews were victims of ethnic cleansing. And secondly, because it's not a one-year project. It's a project that is more than 100 years old. And it's very difficult for politicians, diplomats who deal with the here and now to understand that they are just looking at the tip of an iceberg that has 100 years of layers below it. And it all starts in many ways with the first Zionists who come to Palestine. That's where the ideas of ethnic cleansing grain developed. In the very first encounter the Jews had with Palestinian, ethnic cleansing was developed as an ideology. And most of the early Zionists met Palestinians for the first time in the city of Jaffa. Because as you know, they came in the late 19th century, and the most important group of Zionists came between the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the First World War. That's when they came. The first station, the first place where they met Palestinians was the city of Jaffa, because there were no aeroplanes then. So they had to take a ship from Europe to Alexandria. From Alexandria, they took a ferry to Jaffa, and from the ferry, they were taken by boats to the little harbor of Jaffa on the coast. Now, these people, the early Zionists wrote a lot, so we have very vivid literature of their memoirs, of their memories, of the recollection of the first encounter with the Palestinians. Now, the first thing you understand when you read them is that they really, really believe that they are going to come to an empty place. Most of them. Not all of them, but most of them thought that Palestine was empty for 2,000 years. And they were shocked to see someone else on the coast. Secondly, they had never heard a word of Arabic in their life. So they write about this tough language that sounded to them very hostile. They never had had, and although Hebrew, of course, had this, but they never spoke Hebrew. So definitely not the way you should speak Hebrew. So the language looked hostile. Now the women, as you know, in those days, when fishermen and boatmen came back to the shore, the women used to cry out in joy because they came back. So they thought that these shouts were against them. And then the worst for worst was that the boys who took them down asked, which was common, it was the days of the Ottoman Empire, they asked for bakshish. So what do they write in their diaries? We were shouted at by the people with the hostile language, and we were robbed when we were taken from the boat. This is the Palestine we met, and it was so different from the Palestine we expected. Their leaders were far more sophisticated. They came a bit later. From 1905 came the hardcore from which Zionism was made. And they planted in them, in the next generation, including in my generation and my children's generation, they planted something which we as Israeli Jews live with since our birth. And that is the following, that doesn't matter whether the land was empty or not. In order to survive, you have to colonize the land. But in order to prosper, to thrive, to make life really good, you have to get rid of the Palestinians. There's two different kinds of messages here. Yes, there are other people there. Okay, we'll have to find a way of carving our space. But if we ever want to have a full implementation of the Zionist dream, which is based on two noble ideas, to offer Jews a safe place and to create Judaism as a national movement. There's nothing wrong with that. I have no problem with both. But to do it in Palestine, it will never succeed as long as the Palestinians are there. And you needed someone like the leader of the Zionist movement, David Ben-Gurion, and later the first Prime Minister of Israel, to translate this notion into a plan. He was busy until the 1930s with other things, winning international legitimacy, making sure that Jews will not leave, because most of the Jewish immigrants, settlers left before the 1930s. But once people became, once the Jewish community became more solid, especially after the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe, he began to plan systematically how to translate this formula that Zionism cannot be implemented as long as there are Palestinians in Palestine into a plan. And in 1948, he implemented that plan by destroying half of Palestine's villages, demolishing half of Palestine's towns, and expelling half of Palestine's population in a matter of 9 months. Was it a success story? History will judge. Because although the Zionist movement took over 80% of Palestine in 1948, and from that 80% got rid of 90% of the Palestinians who lived in those 80%. In that respect, it was a success. But on the other hand, in 2014, we know that half of the people who live in what used to be historical Palestine are still Palestinians. We know that there is still a Palestinian national movement, as disunited and fragmented as it is. And we know that most of the Israelis who are captains of their society, from the prime minister through the head of the Secret Service, to the strategic advisors in the university, to Israel's novelists and filmmakers, still talk about the demographic issue as the only remaining existential danger to the state of Israel. Namely, there are still too many Palestinians in Palestine in 2014. And that's why ethnic cleansing is taking place again with new vehemence in 2014, because everything Israel has tried, everything it has tried, has not succeeded in bringing the ethnic cleansing operation to a completion. The only difference is that since 2000, we have, and maybe this is an historical natural consequences, I don't have time to go into it, I want to conclude very soon, but maybe the only difference is that since 2000, we have a different kind of Zionist leadership, which I called in a recent book of mine, the Neo-Zionist leadership. They are back to using and thinking of using the ethnic cleanse, the direct, rough, ruthless ethnic cleansing in order to try and change the demographic reality in Israel and Palestine. They are less sophisticated than the labor Zionists, who were looking for different means of enclaving Palestinians, not allowing them to develop their rural areas. The present government of Netanyahu, Lieberman, and his likes, and the Minister of Defense, have a very direct, explicit approach to ethnic cleansing, and we saw it with their attempt to cleanse 70,000 Bedouins in the Nakab. The only surprise they had was that the young people of the Nakab said to them, "We will resist by force if you do it," which surprised them, and they decided for the time being to put on hold the proper plan. But of course they will try and do it again. Now, the conclusion from that is that you cannot understand why there is a conflict in Palestine. And you cannot begin to develop ideas of how to solve that conflict if you do not use, to my mind, the perspective of ethnic cleansing. If you talk about a two-state solution, it means that you don't mind if the ethnic cleansing continues in 80% of Palestine. You don't mind if Israel is a racist state in the pre-67 borders. This is, to me, a horrible idea.
Could you repeat the last sentence?
No, I cannot repeat. I have to go to Malmo in 5 minutes. I'm not going to repeat any sentence. But I will say it in a different way. And so if you have solutions like the two-state idea, where you limit Israel territorially to 80% of Palestine, where you think that Palestine is only the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinians are only the people who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It's not only ineffective politically, because you left most of the problem unsolved. Far more important, you give license to Israel to be a racist state, but within different borders, or more limited borders. And I think that is the new language we have to develop. This is the new idea that we have to push through, that when you talk about peace, when you talk about reconciliation, you first have to talk about delegitimizing the ethnic racist ideology of Israel. It is a state that has laws, which some of them are worse than the laws that apartheid South Africa had. It enacts policies that are based on ethnic cleansing, and it has a discourse that is accepted in the world as legitimate, that if you ever replaced the word Arab or Palestinian there with the word Jew, people would be arrested all over the world for being anti-Semitic. This is something very difficult to convey to people, that we wasted time in the futile peace process, that we allowed the ethnic cleansing to continue under an international umbrella, and that we are talking about a solution that will not stop the ethnic cleansing, but will just allow it to continue by other means. As hard as it may be, we have to change our language. We have to offer a new solution to how to reframe the relationship between the now third generation of Jewish settlers and the local people and the people who were expelled. And one thing that has to disappear from our landscape in Israel and Palestine is the legitimacy to think even of the disappearance of another people as a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very exciting and it made me think. And now we have approximately 1 hour for questions and answers before Professor Papi has to leave for Sweden for another talk. And before we go to the questions and answers and how we are going to resolve that, Elaine, sitting in the front row over here, we'll sell some books of Professor Papi. We don't have that many copies with us today. Some of them are translated into Danish. Others are in English, original versions, and you can buy them at the Solidaritetshuset so that you don't make it here today. Sally and Liam will be going around with the microphones for questioners, and I think it would be a good tradition for dissenting opinions or questioners to raise their hands first. I see one in the yes. And please keep the questions short.
Yes, sir. Question. As I understand, the ethnic cleansing, and I'm talking about the direct violent expulsion, finished sometimes in 48. And my question is, why did they not finish the job, as Mr. Morris puts it? Why was this expulsion put to a halt? And I think, as I understand, Golda Meir had a hand in it. But did they hope to rid themselves of the Palestinians on a later stage?
You're right, it was not completed, and the reason is not the lack of will, but the lack of ability. The reason Israel was left with a Palestinian minority had to do, among other things, with a place called Wadi Ara, which is one of the two big concentrations of Palestinians in Israel, which Israel received after the war from Jordan as part of the armistice agreement. So Palestinians were added to Israel after the ethnic cleansing ended. Secondly, in some parts, especially in the north of Palestine, the ethnic cleansing operation only started at the end of 1948, when both the Palestinians were much more aware of what was going on and resisted much more forcefully, and the Israeli soldiers were much more fatigued and exhausted and could not complete the job. After 1948, at least until 1956, Israeli strategies, including David Ben-Gurion, thought that they should continue the direct violent ethnic cleansing. And until 1956, more than 30 Palestinian villages were expelled, while Israel already was a state, and long after the so-called hostilities have stopped. But what really complicated the matter for the Israelis was their territorial appetite. Because the formula for Zionism was not to have as few Palestinians in Palestine as possible, but also to have as much of Palestine as possible. And when the historical circumstances enabled Israel to take over the whole of Palestine, namely to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, it came with another 1.5 million Palestinians, some of them the very people they had expelled in 1948. Now today we have the documents of the Israeli discussions immediately after the June 67 war. And what one can see from these discussions is that the Israeli leaders seriously thought of doing again in 1967 what they did in 1948 to the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But eventually decided against it. Among other reasons was the appearance of television in our life. They said we didn't have television in 48. In 67 there were quite a lot of foreign crews. Secondly, they did not know whether Palestinians would be expelled that easily twice. And they were not sure that the army can do it after the war was over. And they decided there and then to substitute the direct ethnic cleansing with the kind of structure that we see today in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. People are enclaved, are imprisoned in their own villages, in their own towns, without freedom of movement, sieged in Gaza. This is ethnic cleansing on the land itself, because the other ethnic group does not threat you, because it has no rights and no freedom of movement and is at your mercy. So this is why it was not completed. But the most important thing is, of course, the Palestinian struggle. We tend to look at 48 to 67, especially young Palestinians, sometimes look at this early generation in a very kind of underrating eyes. You know, they dismiss the people who were keeping Palestine alive between 48 and 67. We should rewrite the history of that lost generation. They were the brave Palestinians. They're the ones that everybody thought would disappear. As Ben-Gurion put it, some of them will die and some of them will forget, he said. Well, they didn't die and they did not forget. And I think that that's the main reason the ethnic cleansing is not completed, is because of the Sumud, because of the Palestinian steadfastness. But we need to do a lot more that it will not succeed in the future.
Ser der noget snart? Hello?
I'll repeat the question.
Hello? Britta Bastorgi. You have described sort of this ethnic cleansing going on very planned, very consciously since 1948. Why isn't that a genocide? I mean, it's a slow genocide. And as far as I can see in international policy, if you say genocide, you have a reaction. Are we lacking words, as you talked about before?
Well, I think sometimes ethnic cleansing can turn into genocide, but I think these are two different terms. I think what Israel did, and maybe still is doing in the Gaza Strip, and I wrote about it, is a slow genociding of people because they have nowhere to go and they're being starved and they're being strangulated. But in most cases, it's very important to my mind to be accurate when you describe the crimes of those you want to stop. If you use the wrong language, you lose people who would support it. Most of the Zionist leaders who were and are involved in the idea of ethnic cleansing do not wish to exterminate physically the Palestinians. They want to see them out of Palestine. It's a horrible crime by itself. I think we have to be very careful. We have to use genocide when we think that there is a systematic policy of killing, especially with everything that is going on around us in Israel and Palestine, in Syria. We have to be very accurate what is the nature of the Israeli criminality. Because otherwise we would lose the struggle of representation, as Edward Said used to call it. And I think it's bad enough to have a state that is based on racism and ethnic cleansing that has such international legitimacy. This is our task. Our task is to ask again and again, now that everybody knows, since the emergence of the Netanyahu governments, I keep telling all my sophisticated friends in the academia, they're very sorry. I say to them, unfortunately, you don't have to use any more Foucault. You don't need to use Gramsci. You don't need to use, not even Marx, to explain what Israel is doing. Maybe when labor Zionism was in power, you needed all these theoretical bubble. But now you can get rid of it and just tell us what Israel is doing. And the second question is, because it's so blatant, how come the Danish government isn't doing anything? That's the question. Not why is it not doing anything against genocide. Why it is not doing anything against a racist state that now declares its racism openly. That's the question. It's bad enough.
My name is Irene. I am sitting for Denmark. So what do you think we as Friends of Palestine can do against this policy, this ethnic cleansing? What's your opinion on international boycott movement?
I was talking as an academic. I talked about the analysis, but as an activist, the strategy is quite clear, from the fact that we have so many people who support nowadays the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, and so many universities in the world talk about Israel through the framework of the Apartheid Week in more than 90 universities around the world. It means that people already know in the West what to do versus the Israeli ethnic cleansing. You are not negotiating with an ethnic cleanser. You try to stop them by sanctions, boycott, and divestment. This is the model. The model means that you are not talking here about two sides that are equally to be blamed for an ongoing conflict, and you need international intervention to negotiate, to mediate between them. What you need is an international community that would repeat and do what it did to apartheid South Africa in the case of Israel. That's it. But I think it's nowadays when you walk, you do a tour like I do of lectures, a lot of people already know it, and a lot of people are already actively involved in it. I think we are still lagging behind, that's my agenda, because so many of us still stick to this idea of the two states, which I think is holding us. I really think it's holding us. And secondly, we don't always get the full support of the Palestinian leadership for that kind of action, because Palestinians still live according to the different agenda of each Palestinian group. Hopefully this fragmentation will be replaced by a more united leadership, a more representative leadership, and there's some very good hopeful signs from the younger generation of Palestinians, wherever they are, that they think differently about their future strategy. So I'm in a very hopeful mood today. I hope it stays until Monday.
Just before we move on, Sally, I would just like to know, are there anyone that feel that they're not being seen? In the end over there. Miriam, you see? Up to there. Perfect.
Those who bought cheap tickets upstairs are not going to have the right to speak.
I have a question which is in fact in continuation of the previous questions. First of all, thank you very much for your documentation, especially your books about the crimes committed by the state of Israel. I agree very much with you that we have to be very precise in the words that we're using when it's war crimes or when it's genocide. And I also noted that you make the appeal to the Danish government to raise the question internationally on crimes of Israel. How do you look on to take the use of the UN Convention against Genocide? As far as I know, in the what you call the international legal fight, until now, especially the Geneva Conventions, which is mainly on occupation questions, have been used. But and you, of course, you can discuss whether it's genocide or whether it's war crimes. But from my point of view, I think it would be very good if you, as an academic, made a direct appeal that the UN Convention against Genocide should be used. So then it's not up to you or to me or the Danish government or any others to decide the kind of crime, but that will be then in the responsibility of United Nations.
Yeah, thank you. I actually use the United Nations Charter in the chapter in my book with Noam Chomsky, which happens to be here on the table, Gaza in Crisis. We both talk about it, that you can apply part of it. Indeed, I agree. And that's a good idea, it's a good tactic. But, you know, I'm always worried that people underestimate petty daily abuses that the Palestinians are undergoing. If you will use too much this framework of genocide, you will miss the sinister cruelty that Israelis use in their relationship with the Palestinians. You will not understand how labor Zionism, liberal Zionism, how the peace camp, the Zionist peace camp is working. That's why I think that it's very important to focus on the vision of a Palestine without Palestinians and agree that the means can easily deteriorate to genocide as well. But the important thing is the legitimacy is still granted to Israel as a member of the OECD, as a member with a preferred status in the European Union, legitimacy to be a state that is openly busy in ethnic cleansing on a daily basis. This is something that is not being reported by the mainstream. It's not being taught by the mainstream academia in the West. And this is, for me, a very important mission, but I do think it's a good idea also to do what you suggest.
Okay, yeah, does it work? I should like to know, what impact does the BDS movement, or however you put the letters, does it have in Israel, both as to the economy and as to politics?
Yeah, thank you. Let's start with politics and then talk about the economy. I think that politically the BDS has succeeded in a similar way that the suicide bombs have succeeded. Namely, it brings to the, whenever it's successful, when it's dramatic, it brings to the attention of the Israeli public that there is a problem with what they are doing, and that that people in the world are worried about what they are doing. Usually they don't think that way. As Amira Haas wrote a few years ago, already then, and she was right, she said, for most Israeli Jews, the conflict is over. There's no problem with the Palestinians. There's a problem with some fanatic Muslims in Gaza and in Lebanon, but basically we have solved the Palestine issue. And you can see it from the political platforms of the parties in the last election. Not one of them dealt seriously with the issue. So there's something in the power of the BDS when Stephen Hawkins decides not to come to Israel, that people ask themselves, wait a minute, why is someone like him doesn't want to come? And then you have a short discussion, and that is important. But I think politically it's becoming also a tool that at least activists in the non-Zionist camp are more and more adopting and endorsing. I remember when we started the BDS in Israel in 2002, 2003, we were so few, as you probably remember yourself, I was asked to organize a list of people who support the BDS, and I could only find another 3 Israelis. And I didn't want to publish an ad in Haaretz with 4 names. I thought it was pathetic. So I added a dead academic who just died that year, and I said, okay, he just died, but I knew that he would have supported the BDS. And I added another person who was not an academic, because I thought he is entitled to be an academic. So we had 6. Nowadays we have an internal committee of academics in Israel that supports the BDS of more than 120 members. So it is working in that respect as an agenda for a kind of activism that replaces the Zionist left activism for the end of the conflict. Economically, it's very difficult to judge. Israel's economy is based on areas where the BDS has not been successful yet. Arms trade, high-tech, diamonds, and so on. It has successfully targeted the Israeli agricultural export. It has successfully dealt with some of the banking investment, as you know, trade union connections, and big construction projects, and so on. But the heart of the Israeli economy is not there. And it's very difficult to convince an arms trader to boycott anything when it comes to dollars. And so we have a tough mountain to climb there. Hike, so climb.
Thank you very much, Shalom to start off. I know you get a lot of flatter, but I think it's very important to renew my personal respect, and I'm sure my Danish citizens will say the same. So thank you for unveiling the truth. I had 3 other questions, but I know your time is very short, so I'll keep it to 1. My question is, to keep this optimistic view of yours today, what do you think of the future? Is it realistic to have an aim of giving back the administrative and authority of Palestine back to Palestinians? As we know, there are many different generations of Jews now, and they can't just go back to their homeland of their ancestors. Would it be a realistic aim to have giving back the authority, renaming Palestine back to Palestine, and then make a democratic state where everybody votes for their own representatives, and giving it as this solution? Would you think that is realistic? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. And thank you for the very difficult question. It's very difficult to see. I realize what you're saying. And I don't have a good answer to your question. I mean, I don't know exactly how the many issues which are involved in the relationship between a 3rd generation of settlers, as you rightly say, cannot go back, nowhere to go back to. And 3 generations of Palestinians, and not more, that were oppressed, many of them lost everything they had and so on. How do you rebuild a more just, a more democratic society out of this 100 years of injustice? I think what you can only do at this stage is to find some guiding principles that you agree upon on the way forward, because only the representative bodies of both sides would be able to decide how to reframe the relationship, how to redistribute the national resources, how to implement even the right of return. I mean, we talk about it, but many Palestinian houses, other Palestinians are living in them, not just Jews. I mean, we have many, many issues. They won't be easy to solve, but I think all of them are solvable. All of them are solvable if the principles are accepted. And the principles has a lot to do with who is included as having the right to talk about the future and who hasn't. For instance, the idea that Jews around the world have the right to talk about the future of Israel should be taken out of our dictionary of peace. This is unacceptable. Jews around the world have no stake in the future of Arabs and Jews in Israel and Palestine. No more than anyone else. Palestinians who were expelled have all the right to be part of that discussion. But for the world, it's not like this, you know? For a typical American politician, a Jew who is born tomorrow in Brooklyn has more say in the future of Palestine than a Palestinian refugee in Headway. How do we change it? I know. But what we do after we change it, I don't know, because I won't live that long. That's my son's problem, and hopefully he will have his own sons, and they will deal with it. But my issue is to prepare the conversation between the legitimate members of the conversation. This is very important. The Oslo process, internationally, with the help of Palestinian leadership, said only the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are Palestinians. Only the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is Palestine. We want a new language. We want a new definition, which is an old definition, of what is Palestine and who is a Palestinian, and who are the Israelis who are a legitimate partner for a discussion of the future. Believe me, if we will succeed in having that, all the more difficult issues, to my mind, will be solved. But it's very difficult when some of our best friends, and I'm not using it cynically, some of the best friends of the Palestinian movement still support the two-state solution. It's very, very difficult to do it when such an idea is still sacredly adhered to by very conscientious and moral people.
The gentleman. Yeah. I want to ask about if this is a part of the Zionist plan, and including Netanyahu and the Israeli government, then who should we, as Palestinians, deal with? Or yes, we shouldn't deal with anything called a peace process. And I understand from you said there's no two-state solution. Then I don't see the answer, but just your opinion.
Yeah, well, we had the same in South Africa. You did not negotiate with the white government in South Africa before they agreed that apartheid is over. You cannot. Nobody negotiated with apartheid South Africa about having apartheid only in 80% of South Africa, or that only 20% of the Africans would be under apartheid. Yes, you're right, we're not. Negotiation is not now our target. Peace is not what we are working for now. That's what my whole lecture was about. We are working to stop the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Once it's stopped, we can talk about peace. But if you accept the Israeli notion, first there will be peace and then we will stop the ethnic cleansing. If you take it to the criminal world, it's ridiculous. It's like a criminal comes to you and says, I will continue to act as a criminal, but while I'm doing it, I will talk to you about the future. No way. Yes, we have to change our perspective. Of course we have to. Now it's very difficult. The peace process feeds a lot of people, mouths in Europe. You know how many people became rich because of the peace process? Really, thousands and thousands of Europeans are living well because of the peace process. It had nothing to do with peace, but they live well, so at least it has some good outcome. And a quite small number of Palestinians who are doing quite well out of the so-called peace process, and some Israelis I know are doing brilliantly, they don't need to work anymore because they are connected to peace projects. But this is the travesty. This is the tragedy. That all this money, all this effort created an umbrella that allowed Israel to continue with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Yes, it's not going to be a Rosengarten if you adopt my ideas. Of course not. It means you will be working as a former peace activist. You will be working for turning Israel into a pariah state. And as an Israeli, for me to say it is very difficult. For me to work to turn my own state into a state that is questioned legitimately is very difficult, but I see no other way forward. That's the plan.
Thank you very much for being here today. I would like you to elaborate a bit more on the one-state solution, just as before, because you are speaking of legitimate partners. You have extreme right-wing nationalist government in Israel, in Knesset. But when you're in the street in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Jerusalem, you have the same nationalistic approach between the normal man. How would you make the plain Israeli abandon the flag, abandon the name, the state of Israel, and all that, if your aim is to obtain a one-state Palestine?
Thank you. You know that people forget that when apartheid South Africa fell, more than 90% of the whites in South Africa were still racist. Regime don't change because everybody transforms. Regime change because the regime loses legitimacy, either by its own people, which is not going to happen in Israel, or by the international community. That's the two historical cases you have for a regime change. There isn't one regime change because people were transformed in their mentality, ideology, lost their racism. Think about Germany. Do you think that racism or anti-Semitism in Germany ended because Hitler was defeated? No. Because Hitler was defeated. That was the important issue. There was not a new educational plan that suddenly made people in Europe love Jews. No, nothing has changed in this respect. So, why are people asking me these questions about Israel and Palestine? I never understand it, because this is a unique society. It's a normal society. The people who are in power, who are racist, would stop being in power and would have to share power, not because they will stop being racist, because this is something they would have to do. They wouldn't love it, but they will have to do it. Hopefully, if you are clever, you do the South African thing and not the Rwanda thing. You prepare a new educational system. You work in the long term to create a generation that is less full of hatred, less racist. But if we will wait until Israelis stop being racist, then we will need another 3,000 years. And this is why I think this is all a trick, not by you, but this is usually a trick by people who are not interested in peace and reconciliation in Israel and Palestine. It's a typical Israeli position, by the way, saying that until the Palestinians don't change their attitude, they have your boot on their face, and you want them to say, what a lovely boot, I can see it very close, so I can tell you that it's really nice, the leather that you are having. That's what Israel said. After you say you love the boot, I may remove the boot. It's this whole, the way we were conditioned to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has never happened anywhere else in history. The totally fabricated way. And I wrote a new book, published in February 2014, called The Idea of Israel, in which I try to explain how come so many of us bought such logic when we talk about Israel and Palestine. The Israelis would be forced to live a comfortable life that they have if they want to live in peace with the Palestinians. And they know it. And that's one of the reasons they don't want to do it. And they will not do it because I will convince them with a book. They will do it if I write a big book which is heavy enough to hurt them on their head. That's the only way that they will change.
We'll take one more question from the back row over there, and then I'd like to take the privilege to ask one myself, if that's okay with the reference.
You mentioned that Israelis not believe that they finish their work regarding of ethnic cleansing. But my question: how you can demand on one solution, one state solution, if the Israeli and the international community didn't accept, didn't legitimize our right of existence as a nation, and deny our right to return back to our positions, our country.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you very much. I will tell you where I think there is a hope. Despite the negative attitude of the international relations, the international community, you're absolutely right about that. But I think that it's easier for us to do it now. It's not an incident that the Secretary of State of the United States, John Kerry, said to the Israelis, if this current peace process fails, you will become an apartheid state. Kerry meant not only, I am predicting that you will become a pariah state. He said to the Israelis, your main ally, the United States, would have a lot of difficulty of supporting you if you would become an apartheid state. That was the warning Kerry used. It was not a slip of the tongue. The Israelis heard it from the former chief of the military staff in the United States. They heard it from President Carter. In other words, we are at a historical juncture where the Israeli society made a decision. For many, many years, they hoped that they would not reach this makfar, this juncture. They hoped that they could continue to be both democratic and both racist in the eyes of the world. For that, they invented something called liberal Zionism. But liberal Zionism has disappeared. There are no more liberal Zionists. If you know one, take good care of them, because they are an extinct species. Water them, talk to them. One day you would like to see this phenomenon in a historical perspective. They are gone. Israelis reached the juncture they didn't want to reach, but they have to reach now. And they ask themselves, what would we like to be, a democratic state or an ethnic racist state? Unfortunately, most Israeli Jews prefer an ethnic racist state to a democratic state. But the world is now saying, wait a minute, if this is your decision, we have a real problem of legitimizing it. We could legitimize your game of a democratic Jewish state, although I'm sure most of them knew it was not the reality. But therefore, I think it's not a matter of supporting the liberation movement as much as not supporting the systematic violation of human rights and civil rights in the name of a democracy. Netanyahu is right when he says that the main danger for Israel is the war of delegitimization. He's right. And he's also right by saying that they are losing this war. He's also right. He still thinks that it doesn't matter because of Israel's military power, because of the friends he has in the United States. But I think he's wrong on that. He's also wrong in thinking that he will find the Palestinians who would legitimize Israel as a Jewish state, which is his last demand. He wants, he's gambling. He gambles. He thought, maybe if I convince Abu Mazen, to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, namely as a racist Jewish state, then the world would say, okay, if the Palestinians don't mind, why should we care? This is the reason Netanyahu goes now with all the force. He's going to pass a law next month that Israel is a Jewish state. He wants the world to recognize it. I think he lost touch with reality, thank God. And this is going to expose him for what he is. But, so I'm more optimistic on this. And I hope I'm right. And we'll see you back in Lubia, inshallah.
I think we do have some time for more questions even after I've posed mine. One thing that the thing you're doing in your not only in your books but also in your talk today, you're actually attacking the Israeli narrative from a very fundamentally, not just on the diplomatic level, on the historical level, but also on the ideological level. So you talk about Zionism, and I assume that when you talk about Zionism, you're actually, a lot of people might feel touched by that, in a sense that Zionism, like maybe Islamism or a great many of other isms, means something different to a lot of different people. And it's not just the ideological points of view that you're attacking, you're also attacking the conventional framework of resolving the conflict. So you speak interchangeably of the peace process and the two-state settlement. You might have some Israeli Zionists, perhaps, maybe hypothetically, that supports a two-state settlement, but does not support a peace process. Aren't you afraid maybe that that very broad critique that you're coming with is making it increasingly difficult for, say, the other side, so to speak, to agree with the position, and then you're carving up the space for further conflict rather than, say, based on disagreement, some kind of mutual agreement in the end?
Yeah. I think there's, although Zionism is an ism, it's a very interesting ism. Contrary to some of the conspiracy theories that some people may have in the Muslim world or the Arab world, Zionism is not interested in Iraq, is not interested in Jordan, and the fact that you have a kind of a map on our 10 penny coin is not the map between the Euphrates in Iraq and the Nile in Egypt. It's a very peculiar ideology that is directed against only one group of people. It works for the benefit of one group of people, the Jewish people, although not all the Jews in the world, of course, are Zionists, but it is directed against anyone with regard to the Palestinians. Not Iraqi, not Syrian, not Egyptian. So it has an ism in it, but it's not like Islamism. It's not like Islam. It's a very focused strategy. It's almost very ridiculous in a way, because as a Jew, you can escape from Zionism. You can. You stay in Copenhagen. I don't know why, but you stay in Copenhagen. Okay. You stay in Copenhagen. You can even go to your synagogue without being associated with Zionism if you want. Or you do whatever you do if you feel Jewish, totally disconnected to Israel. We have many like this. There isn't one Palestinian in the world, including the worst collaborators with Zionism, that can escape Zionism. You are guilty because you are a Palestinian, from a Zionist point of view. Unless you de-Palestinize yourself, you say I'm Syrian, I'm Danish, then maybe you're okay. So it is exactly this simple focus on Zionism. We had this debate, from Chomsky also in the new book. Yes, there were shades of Zionism that looked very nice when Zionists came to Palestine. The Brit Shalom, the people who said, we'll create here a binational state together with you. And there were, of course, I'm a nice Zionist. Zionists are nice people, not all of them are bad people. I wasn't a nice Zionist. I'm not nice anymore, and I'm not a Zionist. But the whole issue is, even the the group of people in 1925 that says we create a binational homeland, the one thing that they never acknowledge is that they invaded someone else's home. It's much nicer if I invade your home. It's true. And think about a person coming to you in Copenhagen, knocks on the door, and says, in the name of this ism, right? That's the ism, which is Zionism from a Palestinian perspective. I knock on your door and I say to you, excuse me, sir, I used to live here 2,000 years ago. Now, I'm a nice Zionist, I'm a binationalist, so I say to you, but you know, I'm not an angry person, so we will live together in the house, because I used to live here 2,000 years ago. Most of the Zionists say, I'm sorry, you have to leave because I lived here. In the normal circumstances, you will invite this person to tea and call the nice people with the white gowns to come and take him away. But the world has accepted this idea as academically valid, as ideologically reasonable, and politically as an idea that makes sense. And I'm not, in fact, I'm not going to give up on this, because I think that not discussing Zionism for what it is, and especially Zionism for what it became, is evading the issue. What kind of a state we will have, what kind of policy the Israelis are doing, are all marginal questions if you ignore the major question. What are the Jews are doing in Palestine, and what are they doing to the Palestinians? As I said to the gentleman up there, it's complicated how to solve it again. Of course, it's not easy. Palestinians will have to accept, and it won't be easy, that these invaders are now part of their society. In fact, I think it's much easier to convince Palestinians to have Israelis in the future as their equal members of state than to convince Zionists that Palestinians are equal human beings. Zionism is dehumanization, is a great idea to begin with. And it did wonderful things in Israel. From high-tech to reviving the Hebrew language and turning Tel Aviv, I don't know, into whatever, a groovy city. But Zionism, at the basis of Zionism, is total dehumanization of the Palestinians. And if this dehumanization is the main thing, then it is the main problem to my mind.
Hi, thank you for coming and thanks for the interesting discussion. I heard you mentioned Syria and you something. I would like to hear a comment about Syria.
Yeah.
I would like to just hear also a comment about or an answer of now the Palestinians in the region of Middle East, around Palestine. The Nakba is happening again. It happened in Lebanon, it happened now in Syria. One of your students in 2002 was in Yarmouk camp. Glenn Moran, I don't know if you remember him. And I was working with him and he was like telling me, I have a great professor called Ilan Bali in Exeter University and we are doing something about the Nakba and blah, 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 all of these things. And now the Nakba again happened, and where is the place he went to study of the result of a Nakba, of refugees camp around the region. And the refugees camp around the region now are disappearing. The same history of the Jewish, when they took the boats from Italy to Alexandria, and now the Palestinians are taking the boats from Alexandria to Italy, being beaten by the Italian police and then distributed to Sweden, Denmark, Norway, into integration system where you are now a Danish or a Swedish. And there is also refugees coming from Gaza, West Bank. Last refugee I saw in a camp in Sweden, he said, I told him why you came here, now the West Bank is a bit calm now, and there is no war like what's happening in Gaza. He told me there will become a time where I don't even have the place where I can stand in West Bank because of the settlement. I like your helpful mood, I really like it and enjoyed it, but what is the end of this? What's happening now? I would like to hear more about Syria also. And the Palestinians there, who being now all of the Palestinians here are displaced because of the international community silent and the Arab community silent. And thank you very much.
Thank you. What can one say about Syria? One can only hope that the Arab world will not be silent to begin with. It's not just the international community. One cannot understand the silence of the Arab world. One cannot understand the policies of the Arab governments in the face of this horrible tragedy and crime. I agree with you. I think the Palestinians are a particular victim of this crime once more. And the only thing you can do, if you don't have the power to stop it yourself, is to try and see whether this horrible thing can eventually produce something more positive. I think that the fact that there is a large proportion of Palestinians among the refugees, the new refugees from Syria, brings to the attention of the world the fate of the Palestinian refugees once more, in a very horrible way, but it does it. And I'll give you one example, which is one important issue which should push forward to my mind. Israel boasts the fact that it gives medical treatment to people from Syria who are wounded near the Israeli borders in the war, in the civil war there. I think up to now they treated about 100 to 120 wounded Syrians in Israeli hospitals. Now all the other countries that are neighbors of Syria, who have also a complicated relationship with Syria, all of them, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, accepted refugees. Most of the refugees are there. The only state that did not accept one refugee is Israel. And I think it's an important agenda to push forward that also, both from a humanitarian point of view, but also from a political point of view, the only thing that can contribute to a solution to the conflict in Syria that is related to Israel and Palestine is a new conversation about the right of return. So one can only hope to make the second Nakba, as you call it, something, a horrible event that maybe would produce a different understanding. The rest is up to us to convince the Arab world, the international community, to deal with a very complex reality. The problem is that we are facing a far bigger process than Syria. I'm a historian and tend to look at things more broadly. I don't think what we see is the collapse of Syria. What we see is the collapse of the political structure that the colonial powers had built after the First World War. This is collapsing. It doesn't happen in one moment, and it's not happening the same way everywhere. But the Middle East, as the colonialist powers have built it, is disappearing. And part of it, of course, relates to Israel. But the Israelis do not recognize, do not understand it, that they are part of this construction that the colonialist powers created. And this structure is not holding on, And I wish it would collapse in a less tragic way, as it does in Tunisia, for instance. But we cannot control all of it. We can only hope that we will have enough people who would convince both sides that they are slaughtering too many people for the wrong ideas. But you're right, Palestine is connected to it, and the Palestinians are victims again, but we can only hope that Palestine would come out stronger out of this. And if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it bleeds less than many other conflicts, and that gives us a lot of hope. Despite the fact that many people were killed, there is still enough goodwill, I think, to build something new. Maybe it will be even better than some of the Arab countries when it's liberated. But you're absolutely right, we should not forget what's going on.
So there's one more question. I see two. There's one on the middle row there, another one in the front row, and perhaps the last one. Where are you pointing?
No.
Over there. Great.
Yes, I want to ask that how can it be that some Palestinians have an Israeli passport? How could it be that some Palestinians have an Israeli passport?
Israeli passport,
Yeah, and how is their situation now in Israel? Is it threatened or?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, the Israeli government, when it realized in 1948 that a small minority of Palestinians who were left inside Israel had to decide what to do with this. Ben-Gurion, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, wanted to get rid of all these Palestinians, not to give them citizenship, or as you call it, passport, not to give them citizenship. But most of the Israelis said, we can tolerate this minority, and in fact it can serve us for our image as a democracy. As I said, Israel was controlled until the 1970s by liberal Zionist establishment that really believed it could sell to the world the idea that you are both an ethnic state, a racist state if you want, and a democracy. And there's nothing better than to show that Palestinians can vote, can be elected, while actually maintaining an apartheid system as far as they are concerned. It worked for a while, and it's not working anymore. So I think that community is under a great danger now. Because if I'm right that Israel has decided to give up altogether the democratic game, they will be the first victims of this change. However, I think all the Palestinians who live between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean are now the victims of what I call neo-Zionism, the new kind of Zionism we have. In fact, the short run is alarming, frightening for every Palestinian who is under Israeli control, whether in Nazareth or in Bethlehem, it doesn't matter. However, in the long run, because it's the same Israel now, everywhere, Israel in Ramallah and Israel in Jaffa is the same Israel. We are enabled to talk to people about a new solution that relates to every Palestinian who is a victim of Israeli policy, not just in the West Bank, and to the whole, and to discuss the whole Israeli political regime as an illegitimate regime. So they are in great danger, and if you look at the people in Akka, they are under danger of being ethnically cleansed. You're looking at the people in the Nakab, they are being ethnically cleansed, their villages are being destroyed. You can see the people in the Galilee are being strangulated. People who live in cities like Haifa are going to be subject to more and more racist laws. It's not good times. It's not a good time to be a Palestinian in Israel. It never was a good time, but now it's particularly bad. But I think it's part, I'm optimistic, I think it's part of the end of the bad things. When the bad things come to an end, they're very bad, as Lenin has told us. It becomes worse because before it becomes better. And we could see it in South Africa. The South African regime was particularly nasty in the last years of its existence, unfortunately.
Three more questions.
Yeah, there's a question up here. What are the historical reasons behind the fact that the international community has been considering Israel as a legitimate state since 1948? Why is this so? Why is it so that the world has been accepting Israel from the beginning of its creation? Is it because of the Shoah? Is it because the international community has a negative bias towards Arab peoples? Why is it so? Guilt?
It all depends on a Danish publisher called Clay. If they will translate my new book, The Idea of Israel, then you will have all the answers. My last book is exactly an attempt to answer your question. But I'll give you in a nutshell the idea. The idea of the book is that although the Holocaust played a role, long before the Holocaust, the world legitimized Israel. And although it's true that Jewish lobby in America is important, as Mearsheimer and Walt claim, long before AIPAC was invented, Israel had international legitimacy. The main reason is that the Zionist movement from the very beginning worked very hard to market Israel through its academics, its filmmakers, its cultural producers, and I describe in my new book how they succeeded in creating, taking a lie, historical lie if you want, and turning it into scientific truth, and a good film, and a good book, and a good poem, and a good PR campaign. and they had it easy because the Palestinians were not so good at it. But it's over. Nobody believes that book. Nobody takes seriously the film anymore, and their academics cannot write their lies anymore, cannot display the lies as academic truths anymore. So this success is over, but it succeeded for many, many years because they really worked hard on the success. They were helped by historical circumstances. Undoubtedly, the Holocaust helped. Islamophobia helped. More than anything else, anti-Semitism helped. The closest people to Zionists are anti-Semites. Both of them don't want to see the Jews in Europe. So it worked. But it's mainly hard work. I really respect them in my book for the way that they built this idea that the best thing that has ever happened to civilization is modernization, enlightenment, and the best example for a successful modernization and enlightenment project is the State of Israel. You will be surprised how many brilliant philosophers and writers and intellectuals in the West bought this idea. Some of them still do.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
For the one-state solution, would it be necessary for the Palestinian Authority to dismiss itself and go back to the time before Oslo? Because it seems to me that after Oslo things became increasingly worse, and that there is a Palestinian Authority seems to legitimize a lot of things that did not happen before.
Yeah. Well, sometimes in life, bad things are also good things. We know it from our life, personal life. So the PA is a bad thing, but if you remove it, what will be instead of it? You have to think more responsibly, I think, of what we do instead of it. Of course, I can see, I was one of the first ones who said that the Palestinian Authority is a subcontractor of the Israeli security. It allows Israel to continue the occupation. I'm familiar with that, and I agree with this analysis. But it's also a provider of life for people. It organizes life. So if you take it out, to think that Israel immediately will take over is not understanding how the Israelis work. The Israelis would love to have chaos in the West Bank for a while, for gangs to take over the streets, for people to do whatever they want, and so on. So we have to offer a viable alternative to something which is definitely not serving the Palestinian cause, for sure. But first of all, it's a Palestinian debate. I think they have to, we cannot do it for them. Because there are some Palestinians who think that the PA is a kind of national achievement by itself. I don't see it like that, but I respect the views. So there has to be an internal discussion. Maybe the new attempt to reconcile Hamas with the Fatah is beginning of a new period in this respect. Definitely the peace process is there. The two-state solution is there. So, and everybody knows it. The question is, what is the role of the PA in a reality where there is no two states? I think many people would look at it differently, including people who support it. So it's very easy to sit here and say dismantle the PA. I don't mind saying it. But I know the reality in the West Bank. You have to think about the people themselves as well. And I think it's much better to come with a solid alternative. And a slogan of one state is not a solid alternative. It's a nice slogan, but it's not a solid alternative. What will happen there the moment the PA dissolves itself? How should it dissolve itself? And so on. So I think it's a legitimate conversation. It's a very legitimate conversation, by the way, that many Palestinians have, including the head of the PA takes part now in this conversation. Why the hell should we continue with this Palestinian Authority? So the conversation is there. It's much better to include it, to my mind, with a more general analysis of what is the best strategy for the Palestinian movement, what is the best strategy for the peace movement, and so on. This has to be included in a more general analysis, in my mind.
And a final question.
One question here. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your work. You touched very briefly on peace activists and involved in like the coexistence projects. Do you think in the same way when you talk about the two-state solution and how it has hindered or any progress or been a problem for progress because of its focus on an impossible solution? Do you think that the peace activists on the West Bank and NGO and the coexistence industry is in the same way a hinder for any real progress?
Of course, I said it myself. I think, however, I think much depends now in 2014 what kind of conversation you have. I think not having a conversation with Israelis who believe in one state and who believe that Zionism should be confronted, that think about a different relationship, not having a conversation with them, to my mind, is a mistake. And I know there is people who include even these Israelis as part of normalization of Tadbir. I think it's a mistake, it's a great mistake. However, I do fully understand that nobody wants to meet anymore with people from what is left of the Zionist left that want to push forward initiatives like the Geneva Initiative and so on. I think even if these people meant well, it's a waste of time to my mind. It's a waste of time to say, wait a minute, you know what? Maybe if we will sit another 5 minutes, there's another way to show the two-state solution that the Israeli public would accept. It's not going to work. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of the Swiss government's money in the case of the Geneva Initiative. It really is not even out of hate, not out of saying I don't want to meet Jews. I think it's a waste of time. We all need our energy and time for a different project. And that project is to think of how Jews and Palestinians, the Palestinians who were expelled from Palestine, should live in a more democratic and more equal and a more just state. The peace process presently and whatever comes under coexistence project has nothing to do with this vision. The vision of a democratic, equal, just state. To my mind, this is our way forward, and we have to work towards it. And the first step, even before we know what kind of a state, and you know there are arguments. People say binational state, some people say democratic state, some people say secular state, some people say no, I don't want to be in a secular state. These are all open discussions we will have to have, all of us. But you cannot have this discussion if you don't agree on what I call the new dictionary. That the problem is that Israel is still a colonialist state in the 21st century. And it still colonizes Palestine. It still ethnically cleanses Palestine. And we have to put a stop to it before we say what should come instead, which will be for the benefit, to my mind, not only of Palestinians, but also for Jews who live in this. Thank you.
Jeg vil gerne takke alle sammen for at komme i dag, og tak til Ilan Hardy for the speech. Omar Shargawi, som har lavet dokumentaren fra Haifa til Nørrebro, han kommer den 24. maj kl. 18 til 21 på Imamernes Fagforening, Lygten 10. Og der er fri entré. I bør gå ind og se det. Ikke mindst dokumentarfilmen, som Omar han vil sætte i en nutidig kontekst. Og så vil jeg sige tak for alle spørgsmålene, og der bliver desværre ikke tid til at snakke med Ilan, fordi at vi skal direkte videre til Malmø, hvor han skal give en ny tale. Men dejligt, at I kom.
Har du det?
Ja, jeg har fået sådan